uh, informal conversation about taxi deregulation and the emergence of rideshare. Um, I'm joined by two of the leading experts on that topic, Veena Dubal and Marshall Steinbaum. And I'm not an expert, so I'm just going to ask the questions and let them answer. And the format will be um, I'll ask sort of broad questions, and I have an alternating order of who's going to answer them, and then I'll ask some follow-ups to the extent things remain unclear, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So hopefully there'll be plenty of time for discussion and back and forth. But I'm very excited to have this conversation. So so I wanted to start with Veena and to sort of give us the background on um, what taxi regulation looked like at mid-century. What are the sort of basic characteristics of entry restriction, of price regulation, of labor standards, and so on? Um, and then that's not a static thing before rideshare. So give us a sense. You've done a lot of work on how that changed even before rideshare. So set it up for us at mid-century, and then sort of how that changes leading up to the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, sure. I want to call out that there's a former San Francisco taxi worker on the call that I see, Athen Rebellos. Nice to see your name, Athen. Who could probably tell us a lot more about his experiences. But I'll just say that so regulation in U.S. cities of taxis really emerged in the 1930s amidst the Great Recession. A lot of the regulation initially was around price gouging consumers, so it was price regulation in the municipal setting. So setting what fares were going to cost and standardizing them for consumers, and then from there we got vehicle caps, and vehicle caps were a way to restrict supply so that companies and workers could actually make money, because when you had restricted fares and pretty level demand, there was kind of only one way to guarantee that these were successful businesses. Over the course of this time period, in many cities, including in San Francisco and New York, you saw a lot of agitation among taxi workers. So it's interesting to note that today, when we talk about ride-hail drivers or on-demand workers, a big thing that you hear sort of unions that want to strike a compromise with capital. You hear them say, "Oh, this is a completely unorganizable sector. We'll never be able to organize Uber drivers or Lyft drivers, and because they're just like roaming around in their cars, how could that possibly be an organizable space? So we have to strike a deal with these companies." But in fact, taxi workers were fully organized as early as 1909 in San Francisco. There's a chauffeurs union. It was actually started out being a really not just a regulated industry, but a really radical union. And by mid-century, they had used these sort of basic regulatory frameworks, the vehicle caps and the fare regulations, leverage those to get many other wins for workers. And workers had sort of the freedom and flexibility that workers have today, but they also had a wage floor. So taxi workers, by and large, worked on commission. So like the more they worked, the more money they made per shift, but they didn't. But they had a wage floor, so they wouldn't fall below a certain amount. And they also didn't have to pay for anything. It wasn't yet a gas and gate system, so they didn't pay for gas, they didn't pay for insurance. It was what was like considered middle class union work. By the late 1970s, early 1980s, as a result of, I think, a confluence of factors that I've written about, including and this is true for those listening, this is like historically true in the U.S. across unionized sectors during this time period. The union was seen as being conservative, in cahoots with Yellow Cab in San Francisco. They were seen as de-radical, and there were like rank and file reform movements within the taxi industry trying to push for more for workers, and really trying to, I think, integrate the taxi industry into public transportation more broadly. And that is something that we end up seeing, is that over time, taxis are considered public utilities. They're seen as supplementing the existing public transportation infrastructure, not supplanting it. And a lot of the kind of regulatory discussions you have in City Hall really sort of are built around this idea. So in particular, taxis end up playing not just an important role for workers and their families and for the elite who don't have to take public transportation, but actually for people, paratransit users, the elderly, people for whom public transportation just like doesn't work, the handicapped. And so this is seen as not just a public utility, but also a public service. By the late 1970s, in large part because of the weakness of the union, when there were these creative lawyers who came in after Yellow Cab went bankrupt as a result of corruption, they said, hey, like one way to make this a more steady, lucrative business is for us to, instead of having these union workers, take advantage of the fact that these workers don't trust the union anymore and say they can be free and independent. And so they went from being unionized employees to literally almost overnight being quote unquote independent contractors who did the exact same work in the exact same way, but instead of getting a guaranteed income, instead of having health care through their union contract, etc., they had to pay to work. So they paid a certain amount of money per shift to make a living. And early on, this seemed like a good deal. So for in the late 70s, early 80s, throughout much of the 80s, what you see workers organizing and agitating to go back to sort of a union model, primarily because of the loss of health insurance and the lack of security. But you also see a lot of workers figuring out how to make bank. And so you see sort of this division happening. And I should say, unique to San Francisco during this time is that medallion holders had to be working drivers. So only people who, except for a few pre 1976 medallions, the people who held medallions were workers themselves. And so there was an incentive to stay in the industry. Getting a medallion was kind of like a retirement package, semi-retirement package. And so you had further divisions. You had workers who were medallion holders, workers who weren't medallion holders. All of this sort of lent itself to sort of a divisive labor politics in different ways. And then in 2009, so after the Great Recession, San Francisco was hit particularly hard. The area around San Francisco where a lot of these taxi workers lived and had bought houses was hit by all of these subprime mortgage markets, or they were in these subprime mortgage markets. And so you had not only like very, very precarious work all of a sudden, but you also had people who were being impacted in lots of different ways by the crash. And at the same time, the mayor of San Francisco, then now Governor Gavin Newsom, thought he had this brilliant idea to fix the city's problems, our city budget shortfall, by asking taxi workers to pay for their medallions, which previously they had gotten off of a list for no money. It was just a license. So he commodified these medallions, and as a process that he started. By 2012, hundreds of almost entirely immigrant workers had put down, a good $250,000, taken out 2 or 3 loans to get a medallion. And at the same time, the city allowed Uber and Lyft to start working for the first time anywhere. So while you had all of these vehicle caps for the taxi industry, all of a sudden you had an upsurge of vehicles in the street that were acting as taxis, but ended up not being regulated as taxis. And so the medallion became worthless because as this artificial way to curb supply became irrelevant with any number of Ubers and Lyfts on the street. It didn't matter anymore. No one was buying them, and so a lot of people went bankrupt. A lot of people committed suicide. People died of broken hearts, and like, literally broken hearts, and we're in a kind of the situation brought to the situation where we are today. But I think the most critical things to take away from this sort of long history that I've said is that there were price controls, there was supply controls, the industry was treated as a public utility. So it was seen as a supplement and treated as a supplement to public transportation, not supplanting public transportation. And for much of the 20th century, I would say for good 85 years, this was like middle class work. And that is certainly no longer the case.
Marshall, did you want to supplement any pictures of the sort of pre-Uber era that Veena just gave us?
Yes, I do. I want to make one big point in response to everything that Veena was just saying, which is extremely useful, which is the combination of price controls and supply controls sustains what in economics we annoyingly call a pooling equilibrium, but I think is more generally referred to as cross-subsidization in the regulated industries literature. So what that means is you can think of a taxi market as one having fluctuations in demand over time. So sometimes there's a lot of people who want to take trips, sometimes there's not so many. The idea that taxis are a public utility or a public service that Veena was referring to means that you want there to be taxis available all the time, even though there's not high demand all the time. And so what cross-subsidization does in a kind of temporal context means that the drivers are incentivized to be on duty, so to speak, to take rides even at low demand times, because they can be assured that they'll be compensated in terms of high utilization when demand is high. And so consequently, they'll be willing to show up for work or whatever to get in their taxi, I don't know, at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday or something like that, where there's probably not a lot of people who want a taxi ride, but there might be one person who likes to go to the grocery store at that time, say a disabled person, for example, who wants to go when the grocery store is pretty empty. And that person should be able to get a taxi, and the combination of entry restrictions and price and minimum price regulations, or as Veena alluded to it, wage floors, mean that there's somebody there to take them to the grocery store when they want to go. The other dimension in which cross-subsidization matters in regulated taxi markets is geographic. This is a big issue, which we'll get into more as we talk more about rideshare. The economics of transportation are such that you always want to have, if you're on duty and driving, you always want to have a fare in the car. That is, you want every mile that you drive to be compensated by a fare. You don't want to be doing a lot of driving without being paid, the deadheading, as that's called in the transportation literature. Certain neighborhoods are going to be more likely to generate return fares. So this is where you get the controversial practice of discrimination in taxi markets. And the idea basically is, if you're a driver, you want to take those fares that are taking you to a place where you're likely to get another fare coming back from that place or going to the next place. And some neighborhoods are more likely to have such a sort of follow-on fare generated from them than others. So this gives rise to the incentive on the part of drivers to basically only accept the rides that go to the neighborhoods where they think they're going to get another ride. The point of minimum fare and entry regulation is basically to make the drivers less discriminatory, to make them less discerning about which rides they accept, because they know that to some degree, even if they end up doing a deadhead trip, that's going to be compensated by other trips down the line. Again, when demand is more robust, and where they're going to get paid a minimum fare kind of regardless. So they take a trip to the middle of nowhere, don't get a return trip, but at least they have the minimum wage floor, such that the return trip where they're not getting paid for is not as big of a disaster for them as it would be if they didn't have the wage floor. If they were competing down the price for the first trip that took them there, then there's going to be no margin left to pay them for the trip on the way back, so to speak. So both of these elements of the regulated taxi markets are designed to sustain this this so-called pooling equilibrium or cross subsidization, where there's always going to be an element of discrimination in a transportation market. You don't want to be deadheading, but the incentive to discriminate is blunted by the ability to recoup losses that you take today or this hour with profits that you make next hour or tomorrow or in a different part of the city.
Thanks, Marshall. Veena, do you want to add something more further?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, which is that something that really was amazing kind of to me prior to the advent of Uber and Lyft in San Francisco on this issue of deadheading is that, you know, like in every major city all over the world, traffic has been and is increasingly becoming a really big problem, and also pollution alongside traffic. And this is something we can talk about when we get when we talk about the transition to Uber and Lyft. But prior to Uber and Lyft, these were issues that you know, traffic, transportation, congestion, and the environmental impact of this form of urban mobility was something that was discussed a lot from a regulatory standpoint. And in fact, you had we were in San Francisco as a result of like actually taxi workers mobilizing around these issues that they cared about. There was a regulatory move to push the fleets into being hybrid or EVs. Like this is 15 years ago. One of the companies, which was a cooperative, Green Cab, which Athen, who's on the call, was worked at and was on the board of. They also used whatever very little extra money they made each year to buy carbon offsets, and so there was this like strong political commitment, both from the perspective of the workers acting collectively, but also from the city as not only seeing this industry as integrated into public transportation, but also as minimizing the sort of the negative environmental infrastructural harms that resulted from cars more generally, in a way that was actually like really exciting and is gone completely.
Thanks, Veena. And let me ask one more question about this before we move on, which is just so unlike a lot of, you know, industry-based regulation, this is municipal level regulation. It regulates urban neighborhoods. So how uniform, I mean, what kind of variations were there city by city in how taxis were regulated? Let's start with you, Veena, and then Marshall, you can supplement if you'd like.
Sure. Quite different. So what I'm describing, some of the things that I'm describing are very very specific to San Francisco, like the fact that medallions didn't have a monetary value. That's certainly not true in places like New York and Chicago. But big cities, by and large, had vehicle caps and they had fare regulation. Outside of big cities and in suburban areas, you had a wide variety of different setups. It was still municipal regulation because there continued to be consumer concern around safety issues and around price gouging. And so you at least had to have, in almost, you know, in every place that I know of, you had to have a taxi license, which was like a process to get. Like you actually had to go take classes and like have you know, a clean driving record and background tests, etc. So they had to be sort of like it was a profession, and that is a profession in that sense. And you also you know, there were standards around vehicles that were regulated by either counties or small cities, so that there was like checks on making sure the vehicles were safe, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't always a vehicle cap, but there were sort of basic regulations in place, really dependent on the market. But as far as like the large cities went, there was like some degree of uniformity, just to say that there was going to be some way to limit supply, so some kind of vehicle cap and some way to regulate prices.
Marshall, did you want to supplement in that anyway? Or?
Only to make some random speculation, which is my understanding is that there were some one-off attempts in various cities starting in the 70s to eliminate the vehicle caps, and those were all considered to be failures because they invited basically anybody and their brother to become a taxi driver when demand was high, which meant that utilization rates were basically constant and low over time. So
That's exactly right.
the professional drivers could not expect to have the sort of high demand time to have higher utilization, that is to say, make a higher profit from those times, because they were, accompanied by 10 times as many drivers on the streets when demand was high, and so that made it economically impossible to make a living as a taxi driver. So the cities that had abandoned the vehicle caps kind of went back to them at some point in the 70s and
Yeah.
80s.
That's right. So Chicago in particular, I think, had experimented with this idea that maybe we don't need these New Deal era, Great Depression era vehicle caps. And the empirical literature that we have today shows very clearly that in an environment where there weren't these types of regulations in place, it wasn't just not sustainable for the workers, it was completely unsustainable for the taxi companies themselves. That this industry has never been a profitable industry without these kinds of particularly vehicle caps and fare regulations in place.
Well, great. Actually, I think that's a very nice way to transition, Marshall, to this question of how deregulation happened. So Veena brought us up to the like 2010s, and then we got that famous thing that Silicon Valley does, which is disruption. So can you just take us through what how rideshare got going, how Uber got going, and then what they did in order to facilitate, what laws they had to change in order to make their business model work.
Yeah, so the basic law that they had to change was all of them, which is to say that when rideshare began, it was not considered to be taxis, and that is the source of their disruptive power in this case, to dismantle a regulated industry and replace it with competition, for better or worse. Now, we'll get into whether we actually have competition, but certainly to eliminate the effect of entry restrictions and fare regulation. So we have this other company which says that it's a software company, and what they do is dispatch trips from drivers who want them to. I'm sorry, from riders who want them to drivers who are willing to take them. Driver has an account; they're looking at their app and seeing these ride requests. The idea that anyone can do this was, I would say, the insidious mechanism by which the industry was disruptive. So it helped that these companies got started in the Great Recession when a lot of people were unemployed. They needed supplemental income. What the companies are saying is you can turn your personal vehicle, which you have to have a car anyway. You may have extra time on your hands because you're unemployed. Why don't you monetize that time? And we have a very low barriers to entry type profession, in the sense anyone can sign up for a driver account on Uber as long as they have a car that meets minimum standards. So a lot of people's personal vehicles will meet those minimum standards. The legal regime, at least at first, in the totally unregulated world, was what you're doing when you accept a ride dispatched by Uber or Lyft is basically driving your friend around. So that is to say, it's not regulated at all. Nobody's telling you that you're not allowed to pick up your friend in front of their house and drop them off somewhere else. That's a normal thing that friends do for each other. The implication here is that since it's your vehicle and all you did was download an app on your phone, you're not engaging in any commercial activity at all. And if it so happens that your friend's like, oh, thanks for giving me a ride, here's $5 for gas or something, that's also legal. As so money can change hands. Your friend can help you out, if they don't have a car, but they can afford to pay for your gas or something. That's totally legal. So they basically take a non-regulated thing that's like not considered to be part of the economy, so to speak, like not an industry, and use that to undermine all the regulations that keep this industry up and running. So anyone can download the app as long as you have a car. Anyone can take rides. Anyone can decide to be a driver at high demand times, and then stop being a driver at low demand times. And the effect of that is to, on the labor side, certainly deprofessionalize the industry. So somebody who's making their living as a driver needs to be able to get rides all the time, or at least keep their utilization up above a certain amount on average. If, again, everybody is just activating the app and being a driver when the demand is high, then the professional drivers are not going to be able to make a living, and so they will drop out, or the labor standards and coverage in the industry will go down. The other big thing that regulation or deregulation in the form of rideshare entry accomplished is the erosion of what I previously referred to as a pooling equilibrium or cross subsidization into a more kind of cutthroat competition type model where all the drivers need to get rides, and so they're willing to accept rides dispatched by the company at very low fares, and that seems like it's good for riders in the first place. So Uber was very popular among a certain class of consumers when it first started because it seemed like they were underpricing taxi companies, and so making it a lot easier to get rides. And so you got a lot of like people in the general public, but also shamefully economists, basically not understanding how the regulated industry actually functions, and seeing on their phone that, oh, you can get a ride for a much cheaper fare to get from A to Z than you thought a taxi would cost. So that seems like it's very pro-consumer. Prices went down. I got the ride I wanted. The car was perfectly pleasant. The driver knew where they were going, or at least they had GPS. I mean, I think one of the phenomena I remember from the early years of Uber, insofar as I ever took one, was the drivers actually relied way more on their GPSs than taxi drivers typically did, because they were not professional drivers. So these GPSs seem to make, it doesn't matter if you know your way around the city, because you can always have the GPS telling you where to go, but that isn't actually true. So I remember, a couple rides of Uber drivers not knowing where they were going very well, and being totally reliant on the GPS, and that is symptomatic of lower barriers to entry and the deprofessionalization of this formerly, middle class occupation. So in the world of rideshare, the drivers are sort of much broader class of people who are working for less money with lower utilization, and the companies spin this as independent contracting, like bona fide independent work, because you can choose which hours you want to work, and that's good for the drivers. And again, the lower prices, greater competition for each individual fare seems to be good for the riders ex ante. So you got a lot of economists saying this is great. They must be these disruptive innovators that made this industry operate so much more efficiently. What that overlooks is rising incentives to discriminate. So this is the sort of flip side of what I was talking about earlier. The drivers who cannot now cross-subsidize in time or space face a much sharper incentive not to accept rides that are going to leave them in a neighborhood where they're not going to get another ride, or to accept a ride that's going to end up paying them very little. So they have to become very discerning about which rides they accept. Again, the way this works in practice, if you're a driver, is that you have the app activated and you get ride offers from the company, on a sort of, accept reject basis. So you get one, accept or reject, get another one, accept or reject, and so on. The incentive on the part of the drivers as these requests come in is to accept as many as possible, because that's what means that's what ends the deadhead time. So you have a fare now, but oh my God, it sent me to a neighborhood where I'm not going to get another fare back. So I'm going to end up actually making a loss on the fare I accepted. So I shouldn't have accepted it. So you get into a situation where the drivers really want to be very discerning about which rides they accept to make sure they're not going to lose money, because there's not going to be another trip later on that compensates them for the one where they didn't make money. So they get very discriminatory, and then the company gets very deceptive as a result of that. So they want to make it impossible for the drivers who reject the fares that are bad. So they just don't tell them about it. They conceal information, don't tell you up front where the ride's going, and how much you're going to be paid for it. So they're trying to trick you basically into accepting a ride that you end up regretting. And this is where the sort of full force of the separating equilibrium comes in. You have a bunch of drivers whose incentive is to be very discerning about which rides they accept, and then you have a company whose incentive in the separating equilibrium is to conceal the true nature of the rides and try to be as deceptive as possible. And that's basically the rideshare world that we live in now, where insofar as they're making any promises of universal service, which they basically aren't, it's only achievable through deception of the drivers. And just to get into Luke's territory of consumer protection law, which is one of the many areas of law that's implicated in this, if the drivers are independent contractors, that is to say, not employed by the firm, if you're an employee of a firm, you have to do what the boss tells you. So if you're employed by a taxi firm and they tell you pick up that customer, you have to do it. If you're an independent contractor, in principle, you don't have to do it. That's the premise of the here's a ride request, you accept or reject it. You have uh, um, discretion about that, but the company wants you to accept everything that they offer, and so they're going to lie to you about it. If you are an independent contractor, then you are or should be protected by consumer protection law, which means that you're a consumer in this transaction. And if you're being offered something whose terms are being concealed or materially obfuscated and lied about on the part of the company, then that is a potential violation of law. And I think this is an area where rideshare has not yet faced the music.
Thanks, Marshall. That's great. Veena, can you help us fill in how what Uber and Lyft and others had to do to like what laws they had to change in these municipalities to make it possible for them to become friends sharing rides to this whole industry, and how they did that, how they convinced lawmakers to get on their side. I think you are muted.
You're muted, Veena.
Uh,
My apologies. So one, during this moment, we really have to remember that this is like a post-Occupy moment in the Bay Area. This is also we're emerging from the Great Recession, and there's a strong commitment to doing things differently. And these companies were arising amidst other kinds of at least rhetorical shifts in work. So there was a real sense that, this is Airbnb is happening at the same time. There are all these peer-to-peer new organizations sort of pushing things like people being able to, cook out of their home and make money that way as opposed to working in a restaurant. People try really, I think, and not the investors, but I think real people trying earnestly to reimagine how their life was going to be after this moment. And boss culture is really ugly. Nowhere else in our lives do we maybe completely subordinate ourselves in the way that we have to in the workplace. And so there's a real feeling of like, well, how can we do things differently? And I think leveraging that feeling and the desire for change and also manipulating it, these companies like said that they were something different. And so there was a lot of this happened through a really gross ideological maneuvering around what it meant to share. Somehow that we were all going to be we wouldn't have to use our own cars, and so that this would be good for the environment because we could use other people's cars. I mean, it didn't make sense, but this was the way in which these things were spoken about. And also, most importantly, I think this was post-work. No one's working. We're just like, as Marshall articulated, just like driving our friends around. And the early model was, in an effort to get around city regulations, was a like basically pay whatever you want model. Like you could just like not pay or feel pressure to pay and just like give a little bit. It was sort of like a gift idea. Makes me think a lot of Marcuse. And anyway, but so in the early days, they hired really savvy lawyers, Kecker Van Ness lawyers here in San Francisco, who knew all of the right people, who really convinced our mayor at the time, Mayor Edley, a former Maoist and tenants' rights organizer, who had been encouraged to run by Ron Conway, who was an early Uber investor, who had put a lot of money and time and energy into Edley. Edley would quite literally prevented the Municipal Transportation Agency from ensuring that these companies didn't continue to operate in violation of local taxi laws. And the lawyers that I referenced did a really kind of magical job of convincing city regulators and then state regulators that these cars were neither taxis nor were they for hire vehicles. So nor were they the kinds of black cars that are regulated by the by California, by the state. And this was like a sleight of hand. Like they clearly met these definitions. Taxi worker, they met both or either definition, but they were like, no, 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 we're different. There were all these retreats that happened. Ultimately, the regulations that were written to apply to these companies at the time, it was Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar, were the regulations that were written by the lawyers for the companies. Like that was pretty much rubber stamped. And the two things that were left out of the regulations were risk and of course labor protections. And labor protections were left out, despite the fact that many of us raised the issue early on, because and through the sense that this was a temporary thing because these companies were going to be moving on to autonomous vehicles. So there was no point in even dabbling in labor issues, because this was 5 years from 2013 and 2014, we were going to have autonomous vehicles anyway. And then with regard to risk, the early laws didn't even have you didn't even cover consumer risk with regard to insurance. So these companies were the workers themselves were laboring with their personal insurance, but they were doing commercial work. And so in these events of accidents, the workers weren't covered, the riders weren't covered, and the state just really looked in the opposite direction. When there was an attempt to introduce insurance regulation by Susan Bonilla, the companies went in and just tried to mar her name. They distributed all kinds of really insulting, belittling flyers in her jurisdiction. I mean, it was just very, very ugly. And of course, there was, again, no vehicle caps. There were very, very limited regulations around what the standard that the vehicle had to meet. And all of that, all of the ensuring that the vehicle was meeting those standards was outsourced to the companies themselves. So no one from the state was actually checking to see if these were safe vehicles. And so you had your first set of, what we now call these transportation network companies, this absurd term, developed by the state of California. And then because what happens in California spreads all over the world, then more or less replicated in not just states across the country, but literally in nations across the world.
Thanks, Veena. And so I'll go back to you before we get to this sort of, let's piece apart what the impact is. So first of all, like, what does the regulated taxi industry look like now in the aftermath of this disruption?
I'm sorry, Luke, if you don't mind to interrupt you, I have 2 points I'd like to make in response to what Veena just said.
Sorry, please.
To yank things away. One is on the sort of larger context of labor regulation not being enacted in the rideshare industry, at least initially, and largely still. This is a example of something that you see over and over again in the history of labor, broadly speaking, and labor regulation more specifically, where who gets covered by the regulation comes down to some assessment of who counts as a real worker or not a real worker. And so if you think, the most famous kind of instance of this in scholarship that's going on right now is about the Fair Labor Standards Act of Federal Law of 1938, where it carved out a bunch of industries that disproportionately employed Black workers in the South as part of the ensuring the continuation of the Jim Crow regime, because the idea was agricultural and domestic work isn't quote unquote real work because it's temporary or seasonal or independent, you're your own boss or something like that, such that you're not covered by you don't rise to the status of a real worker unless you're not entitled to the sorts of regulations that make a given profession or occupation sustainable as a source of income, as a stable source of income. All that question of who counts as a real worker, obviously very raced and gendered in history, as it has been in the rideshare industry. Also, kind of reflecting on economic debates over, for example, the minimum wage, the idea that minimum wage workers are largely teenagers living at home, for example, who therefore don't need to make the full wage that a full-time working age adult would make, because they're doing it for supplemental income or something like that. It's not really what they're living on. Therefore, they don't need to be protected by the minimum wage law. Even as that's not actually true about who minimum wage workers are, it sort of serves this rhetorical function of being they're not really relying on this to make a living because they're not real workers, so therefore they don't deserve labor protections. My favorite example, when I teach this to my own students, I speak about the federal census of 1880. What the you're laughing at me, Luke, because you're just imagining being in one of my classes. The director of that census was the founder of
Fantasizing even.
that was the founder of the American Economic Association, Francis Amasa Walker. He basically erroneously edited the 1880 census in order to declare that fewer married women, children, and old men were in the labor force under the definition that that census adopted than really were. So all the enumerators went out there. They were, they had their instructions. They said, if the respondent says X, Y, and Z, then that means that they're in an occupation or what, that you can classify them according to the following occupational directory, send all their reports back to Walker in Washington. And he's like, oh my God, child labor is way higher than I thought it was. Married women's labor outside the home is much higher than I thought it was. That's controversial because the implication at that time was these women and children are taking jobs that men should have to support their families. So I'm going to edit the census because I don't think that those people can be real workers, even if they meet the definition of a worker supplying market labor that I gave my enumerators to begin with. So, this is a long line of ways to undermine labor standards. And then, once anybody can be a worker in an industry without labor standards, then the position of people who are trying to rely on that labor to make their living is totally undermined, and consequently they no longer can, because the boss can just go out and get a quote unquote not real worker to do the work for cheaper. The other point I want to make is about surge pricing in particular as being a constituent of the early success of the gig companies and kind of muscling their way in regulatorily, if that's a word. I come back to the sins of my fellow economists, not just Francis Amasa Walker, but also economists who were then employed at the Federal Trade Commission, and just generally in research. One thing that Uber has been very, very good at is lobbying economists by giving them access to Uber's data for them to write papers about how Uber is creating all these wonderful job opportunities for lots of workers. And in particular, they use the concept of surge pricing. So this is a practice that is pretty much no longer being employed by these companies. As I understand it, they've moved on completely to price discrimination. But the idea with surge pricing was the rideshare companies are going to get a share of gross revenue. That's how they're going to get paid. So 30% of gross fare or something like that, 25% of gross fare. What do they do to set what the gross fare is? Well, in real time, they try to equilibrate supply and demand. So if there's lots of people who want to ride and too few riders out there, or too few drivers out there, they implement a surge, price goes up. That brings more drivers out onto the street because it's worth their while to get in the car and turn on the app, and serves this demand, or alternatively deters it to other means of transportation. So this is a way of making the market clear in real time, either to bring in more drivers or to bring in more riders. When there's too many drivers on the road, prices decline to very low, and then it becomes economical to get in a taxi. I think economists were overimpressed by the technological sophistication and an analog between surge pricing and, I don't know, the Walrasian auctioneer, whatever metaphor you want to take from orthodox neoclassical economics, and sort of thought, oh, this company is in itself instantiating the free market that exists in my head canon or whatever. So that means that it's economically efficient, and consequently, any attempt to impose taxi regulations on this unregulated industry to the effect of, say, minimum or maximum fares, as we've been discussing here, that's going to interfere with the surge pricing algorithm, which is, you know, God's gift to mankind, and therefore we shouldn't allow it. So there's a letter from economists working at the Federal Trade Commission about 2014 to a city alderman in Chicago who basically had proposed an ordinance in the Chicago City Council to the effect of these are taxis, they should be regulated like taxis, or at least they should have a regulatory regime that approximates the one that we use for taxis. You know, these fancy economists at the Federal Trade Commission were basically said to this alderman, you know, tisk tisk, you don't understand the brilliance of the economics of rideshare, so therefore they should not be regulated as a taxi would be under this surge pricing. You know, kind of coda to all this discussion of surge pricing. Again, they don't use it very much anymore because you can't actually make any money that way, because you don't want the market to clear if you're trying to make a profit. What you want is to charge a price that's as high above your costs as possible, and you don't get that way by dynamically setting the price in order to equilibrate the market. You get that way by price discrimination. So pay the drivers as low as possible and individually tailor the wage offers to the drivers such that you know they're going to accept the offer that you give them, and then charge as high of a price to customers as you can get such that they'll accept it. So to maximize the difference basically on a ride by ride basis, and they do have the technological capability to do. It's much less favorable to consumers, so you don't get economists saying how great it is, as there was in the days of surge pricing. But that is the business model that has actually developed, is they have gone public and tried to say that they're able to make money.
Thanks, Marshall. So, Veena, did you want to supplement that sort of picture of the industry at all anyway before and then you can also sort of move into what the regulated industry looks like?
Yeah, so we have 10 minutes, so I don't want to, right, we end it too?
Well, I think we can go over for Q&A, but if you have to leave, you can leave. That's okay.
Okay, we'll see how long it lasts. I have a daycare that I'm running today on Veterans Day, but
okay.
so I told them all that they could stay out of here until 2 o'clock. So you might start seeing like 5 little heads popping in at some point. So you know, it's actually like a good transition to think about like the 2 regulatory frameworks that have been set up. So you have the taxi industry. There have been some attempts to quote unquote level the playing field, whatever that means, for the taxi industry in different cities. But you still have the municipal setting, and cities trying to creatively, maybe not so creatively, save the taxi industry. And then you have almost in every state across the country, a situation that the companies have lobbied for. So not only have they enabled these sort of new, much more laissez-faire transportation laws that apply just to them, but they've also secured a situation that is modeled after ALEC regulations, such that in almost every state, only the state can regulate the industry. So you can't have regulations on a city level. And the really big kind of critical thing in the taxi industry was that taxi company or taxi workers themselves and the union, they had developed relationships over time with legislators. And it was really like, you really saw the sort of messy everyday politics of municipal democracy, in the sense that taxi workers were constantly, like, for example, in a pandemic, they would have gone to their legislator, their city council, and said, you know, like, we need PPE, or the city must like increase fares because like we're risking our lives to do this, or we need special health insurance during this time. And that became impossible. So in California, the California Public Utilities Commission was tasked with regulating and developing these laws that I referenced when I spoke previously. And the California Public Utilities Commission, in addition to, you know, failing miserably in all of its other regulatory attempts, is pretty impenetrable as like a democratic agency. You know, it's a very different process. You have very little like one-on-one access to people. They have this rulemaking system where they put out, you know, they're saying, we're going to make rules. Do you want to write in? And then people have to have the wherewithal to sort of write in to make comments, and then they sort of consider them, but also not in as a democratic and a public way that a city council might consider them. And so you like literally procedurally kind of all over the country have a body of regulators who are much harder to access. on the part of people who have little power. And so not only do you have these two systems where you have one where you can have as many vehicles on the road as you'd like, companies can charge whatever they want. There are now some insurance requirements, hybrid insurance requirements, but I should say that most ride hail workers cannot afford hybrid insurance, so they are not being met. And so every time you get into one of these cars, you're really taking a huge risk, and the workers themselves are taking a huge risk. And you have that, and then on the other hand, you have an enduring taxi industry that is in most places, I think, continuing to survive off of paratransit work. So the work that I spoke about at the top of the hour, where a lot of people who are either physically disabled or elderly who have some kind of contract with the city for benefits that will enable them to use taxis to get around and do their work. So kind of, again, like an extension of the public transportation system. And then other city agencies that are using these taxis that have accounts with the taxi companies. So for example, in Orange County, there is if you have, in order to get your record expunged, if you have 3 DUIs, you have to basically submit yourself to random drug testing. And the county has a relationship with the cab company that will, they'll say, okay, we want to drug test X person, and that person gets picked up in a taxi, taken to the drug testing site and driven back, and the county pays for that. So a lot of sort of state-enabled accounts is how the taxi industry continues to survive, and airport hauls, and people who are sick of surge pricing. People who don't want to pay $300 to get home on a busy Friday night. That's like their primary bread and butter. But because people have essentially been trapped in the taxi industry through medallions and for other reasons, the level of poverty in the taxi industry is really quite something. And a lot of people living in their cars, sleeping in their cars. True also for Uber and Lyft drivers, both in terms of like working conditions. Depending on where you are, it's fairly similar. I think in San Francisco, it's not that different for a taxi driver or an Uber driver. Tends to change, but people are literally making 80% of what they were 15 years ago, and doing so in these really, really terrible conditions. But you can get a car whenever you want, and that's the underlying magic of this. Like the emergence of this entire sector is this sense that the convenience of being able to, certain people being able to move whenever they want to move, necessitates the creation of a servant class of people, a racialized servant class of people whose sort of well-being is, or lack of well-being, is premised on, like, the only way that you can have, given everything that Marshall and I have talked about in terms of the economics of the industry, the only way you can have this thing at the push of a button is through like complete exploitation of the workforce. And so it becomes sort of an externality, like this is what you have to put up with in order to have the quickness of the service. And so these battles continue to be fought. It certainly isn't, the regulatory battles certainly not over anywhere. Kind of the best place scenario is New York City, where, because of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which brought New York City to a halt 3 times through direct actions, has a lot of power, built a lot of power in the city over a period of about 15 years. They actually got vehicle caps, and they got wage regulations for workers, and continue to fight for debt relief, etc. And so kind of like the exact opposite contrast, you have California, where the companies passed Prop 22 in the year 2020, and Prop 22 enshrined their business model into law, making it very, very, if not impossible, to change the law. And for the first time in the history of the United States, created a third category law of workers. So people who are neither considered employees, who have like basic rights and protections, nor are they really considered independent contractors who have the ability to negotiate over the terms of their contract. They are essentially just like subordinated servants to the companies who have these quote unquote benefits, like an insurance. If you already have health insurance, like a way to pay some of that health insurance, but all of these benefits are tied to what they call engaged time, or what Marshall's excludes what Marshall has been referring to as deadheading time. So all the time that you have to wait to get a ride isn't considered working time. So not only are you not paid, but any benefits you might get are not accrued during that time period, which means essentially that you have to work about 60 hours a week when there's like demand is like normal, in order to get any of these so-called benefits. And the research has showed that no one is getting them. Workers are making somewhere around $6 an hour, which puts them at about a third of the minimum wage of most cities. People are losing money from hour to hour. It's an egregious and shameful situation. And it's being challenged in court. The constitutionality of it will be decided at some point this year, probably in the next 6 months or so.
Thanks. All right. Well, so in the there's so much more to talk about, but I definitely want to make sure that we talk about avenues for reform, and then we have at least a couple questions in the comments. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Folks in the audience can feel free to submit on the little Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So let's so Marshall, let's go back to you. What do you think? What do you see in terms of promise of reform? What reforms would be good, and then what sort of hope? What gives you hope out there about available reforms?
Yeah, so Veena already alluded to the municipal regulation of rideshare in New York City as being the sort of good scenario that's come out of this. That is basically the resurrection of taxi regulation. So it's like, oh, we shouldn't have allowed this so-called disruption from the rideshare industry. We're just going to have to like reset up exactly the same regulatory structure that we dismantled in 2010 in order to get the taxi industry to be healthy and sustainable in the long term. So I certainly think that is one path to reform, basically undo everything you just did. The avenue of reform that I feel has been underutilized is something that I referred to briefly earlier as to the consumer protection side, but also specifically the antitrust side of regulation. So when Veena says that Prop 22 created this third category of workers that are neither independent nor employees, but rather just a servant class, I don't disagree with that assessment of what Prop 22 did, but federal antitrust law does not recognize the third category of a servant class. That is to say, an independent contractor is supposed to be independent meaningfully, meaning they set the terms and conditions of the work that they do. And in particular, the vertical control that the rideshare platforms exercise over what are putatively third-party transactions. So the legal position of the rideshare companies is when a rideshare driver takes a customer in their car and drives them to where they want to go, that is a bilateral transaction between the driver and the customer to which the platform is not a party. Okay, we have lots of antitrust case law, specifically in California, about control over third-party transactions on the part of a dominant company of any kind, in this case, a platform. Namely, the independent contractor, the subsidiary, has the discretion to set prices for this third-party transaction, to decide which rides they're going to take and which ones they're going to reject, and all of those constraints on the control that the dominant platform can exercise are being violated actively every day by these platforms. And that isn't just bad for the drivers, it's also bad for platform competition. So notably what rideshare looks like, I mean, there have been other companies competing with Uber and Lyft in the past. Sidecar, which Veena named earlier, went out of business. They sued Uber for violating antitrust law to put them out of business. And that lawsuit eventually gave rise to a settlement of some kind because Sidecar's complaint complaint survived a motion to dismiss on predatory pricing grounds. So a very unusual ruling. That is to say, very hard for plaintiffs to win, even to that degree of getting their lawsuit past a motion to dismiss. Then they settled. So presumably Sidecar's successors got some monetary settlement out of Uber because Uber couldn't risk a negative antitrust ruling against them. There's lots more possibility to use antitrust law to enforce the independence of drivers and preserve platform competition. So now where we are is one dominant company in every market, which is Uber. And then in some markets, Lyft is still active, but seems to be kind of circling the drain, is my understanding. So we're going to end up with a rideshare monopoly, it seems like, in pretty much every market. And that is due to the fact that you cannot compete with Uber by pursuing a business model that would be otherwise very likely to succeed, which is go in, charge a lower take rate, that is, take a lower share of gross revenue and pay the drivers more. That's going to make the drivers prefer to drive on your new platform than on Uber. And they're going to try to share out the benefit of competing with Uber at the lower take rate by charging lower prices to customers. So the drivers would want to use this would-be entrant new platform, charge customers lower prices, seeing lower prices on the new platform, the customers would switch over from Uber to the entrant, and that would enforce some competitive discipline on Uber's take rate. There's no such thing in the status quo. As I said, we're headed straight to monopoly, and the reason why is because of the vertical control that Uber is able to exert over rideshare drivers to the detriment of platform competition, and not just to the drivers, and also to the detriment of customers, because if there were meaningful platform competition, then the customers would benefit from lower fares. So we're seeing a sort of classic predatory pricing strategy play out in rideshare: charge low fares to begin with, get everyone to love your product, then steadily crank up the fare. The sort of added ingredient in the Uber case that we're seeing now in some other tech platform antitrust cases is the most favored nations clause. This is saying you're not allowed to charge a lower price on another platform. In rideshare, the way that the form that the most favored nations clause takes is direct resale price maintenance. So the drivers can't even set their own fares, so there's no need to impose a literal most favored nations clause. Instead, the platform set the fares for them, for customers, so they have no means of discounting on the cheaper platform. And as I said, there's antitrust cases against other platforms that have a similar theory of harm. And I think the time is ripe for bringing the heavy artillery of antitrust law to bear in the rideshare space.
Thanks, Marshall. Veena, I know you have to run, but you want to answer a couple questions and maybe add some thoughts and reform. So on to you.
Yeah. So I'll say, two things that I think are really important moving forward. One is to know that that this space, which is, in LPE language, I say is like encased. It's not really deregulated. It is regulated in these ways that are like extremely problematic and allow for all kinds of capital experimentation. From a labor viewpoint, it's important to understand that there's nothing about the way that they do work that means that this is going to stay just in this space. So we know, of course, that there's a whole food delivery industry that now has emerged that follows the same business model, but it's noteworthy that really there's nursing now, there's warehousing. A lot of the scabs in the Unite Here hotel strike in Southern California recently were coming to work via Instagig, I think is the company, something like that. A temp work. I mean, everything can be like gigified in the sense that this is not really technology based, but very much about, or not just technology based, but very much about regulatory arbitrage. And the second thing is that it's because it's encased in this special way, it's really become a space of labor experimentation. So all the kinds of algorithmic management, algorithmic pay, things that we've seen now happen in the ride-hail space has very much shifted elsewhere. So one of the things that I've written about recently is how workers are paid, which is called algorithmic wage discrimination. And this mechanism of personalized digital pay, we now see well beyond beyond the on-demand economy. In fact, it's now like in hospitals and how porters are being paid. IBM is using these mechanisms to pay their workers. They're unionized workers in Japan. It's like being litigated right now. It's a really an ugly disease that has developed and is spreading well beyond the sector. So I think the solutions here are very clear. Is like reinvest in public transportation. What Marshall and I have not talked about is how many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars has been directed away from fair, non-discriminatory, accessible public transportation as a result of the last 12 years of this absurd, like dystopian development. And so in addition to like a reinvestment in public transportation, the enactment and enforcement of the antitrust laws that Marshall articulated, just like also, you know, the enforcement of existing labor laws, like abide by the same laws that Walmart abides by. Like I never thought that I would be at a point where I'm like, just act like Walmart, but literally that's like, this would dramatically change the field in a way that would make it impossible for them to operate in the way that they actually operate currently, and would allow for the kinds of reinvestments in public transportation that we all really care about and know is the underlying answer. So I just want to quickly answer Sue's question and also the question about the co-op. So and to say hi to Marcelo Fonseca, who's an amazing taxi worker in San Francisco, and I think has done a lot to help drivers who have been trapped in these predatory debt medallion sales. So just to Andrew on the co-op, I am very skeptical of co-ops in this particular sector for reasons that Marshall articulated. This is a completely concentrated market. It's very hard for co-ops to operate. And my concern is that the co-ops that have the kind of co-op that has started operated, particularly in New York City, and they've made attempts elsewhere, are operating in spaces where there's robust driver organizing happening. And so I worry a little bit that that the co-op might be those driver co-ops in particular might be sort of a purposeful distraction from some of the very important sort of radical organizing that is happening. I love co-ops. I just don't think that this is sort of possible right now in this market environment. To Sue's question about AVs, as Sue knows better than I, the Governor Lee's name, I can't remember his name anymore. The governor before Gavin Newsom, who we had for like 30 years, who's the governor of California for so long, his name is escaping me.
Brown
Lee, not Lee, Governor Brown, Jerry Brown. Jerry passed or signed an executive order that said that the DMV, this is in 2012, also the same year that Uber sort of was started, that said that the DMV in California was in charge of and creating regulations around autonomous vehicles, which many saw as quite problematic, because what it did was, again, insulate the debate about autonomous vehicles from sort of public discourse. It wasn't happening at the California legislature, and said it was going to be happening within this closed administrative body. And we saw recently, actually, when the Teamsters tried to pass a law, and did actually pass both the California House and Senate, that said that, well, we at least need a human safety driver in a self-driving truck that weighs some 10,000 pounds, that Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed it, saying, well, the DMV is already in charge of safety regulations, so we don't need any more safety regulations. Sue, I think, lives in San Francisco, and in San Francisco, there have been over the past many few years, a proliferation of AVs, both AVs that are gathering data and AVs now that have been testing on human driver or human consumers. So actually we are becoming subject to experiments without our permission, and people have died as a result. And it's the rare case where you see the police, the environmentalists, the fire department, like everyone is like, get these things off the streets. It's been a very interesting anti-AV coalition. And as a result of a number of injuries and deaths recently, I think it was just last week, Cruise's license was revoked. But again, like as a result of death, like when we've been saying for a really long time, these cars aren't ready for the road. There are policy considerations here with regard to work, with regard to public transportation, and all of it is just like, it's like the same exact kind of it's a very similar moment where you have San Francisco very concerned about its reputation as the tech capital of the world, trying to remake its image. What if these AVs work? We don't want to deter them from working, and so we're not going to really think critically about what kind of city we want to have. Instead, we're just going to allow them to operate willy-nilly and then kill people, literally. And so, I don't know what the future holds for AVs in San Francisco. I think 2 days ago, Darek Rashai, Uber and Lyft have divested themselves of these self-driving cars aspects of their companies. He said that AVs are still 10 years away. I mean, every year it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It doesn't really seem that we're ever really going to have AVs in the way that the Jetsons might imagine them. But in the meantime, they are really distracting from the kinds of like optimal public mobility that we know we can have tomorrow if all of that money went to something different. So I'm gonna leave it at that. As Marcelo knows, he's asking about the medallion question. There's been various lawsuits around this. It's a really sticky, difficult question, and I mean I hope that they can. I'm not sure that there's good law on this, but I will leave you all. Grateful to you, Luke, for hosting this, and always learn listening to Marshall, and really grateful that I had this time with you all.
Thank you so much, Veena, and let's leave it there. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Marshall and Veena, for giving up some of your Friday afternoon, including on a holiday. And I learned a lot. I hope everyone learned a lot, and we'll surely have further conversations in the future. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you.